Carolyn Brown is a teacher, writer, editor, and independent scholar. She attended Duke University, then the University of North Carolina, Greensboro for her master's and doctorate. She is the author of A Daring Life, a biography of Eudora Welty, which won the Mississippi Library Association's Award for Nonfiction in 2013, and Song of My Life, a biography of Margaret Walker, which was also honored by the NLA. Many of you will know Carolyn from the History's Lunch programs that she did for those two books. Help me welcome her to talk to us today about Kate Freeman.
Thank you, Chris, for inviting me to speak today. And as I was sitting here, it all came back to me that this is where I began my research. Which is, so much has happened since those first few sessions. But yes, Kate Freeman Clark, there is a file here at Archives that includes a lot of loose clippings and newspaper articles, and then a lot of material on microfiche. And I don't know if any of you have used microfiche, but it's not fun. And when I discovered that the same materials were literally in Holly Springs, my preference was to go to Holly Springs instead of even coming here and using the microfiche. So anyway, I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about my newest book, The Artist's Sketch, a biography of painter Kate Freeman Clark. And we will dim the light so you can see this beautiful artwork more clearly. And I'm happy to see a lot of friends here today, so thanks for coming out to support me. I'm going to begin by just asking if any of you have been to the gallery in Holly Springs. I spoke to one person, so just a few people. Well, hopefully after today, you'll be inspired, perhaps, to make the trip. But that is where Kate Freeman Clark's story begins, in Holly Springs, Mississippi. And that's, the story begins literally in the year 1875, and this picture is a self-portrait and is the image on the cover of the book. She was born to a North Mississippi family whose ancestors helped found the city. Her great-grandfather was the first mayor, and her great-uncle was a Confederate general. Her grandmother, Kate Walthall Freeman, and that's a portrait that Kate did of her grandmother, for whom she is named, married a lawyer and had 3 children before becoming a widow at a very young age. And then Kate Freeman's only daughter, her grandmother's daughter, Carrie, our Kate's mother, married, but like her mother, was also widowed at a young age. Carrie Freeman had married Edward Clark, a photo of Edward, and he was an attorney who worked in a law practice for a while with LQC Lamar. And then he went out on his own and set up a firm in Vicksburg. And our Kate spent her early life in both Vicksburg and Holly Springs, as her mother, Carrie, who was very close to her mother, did not like living away from her. In 1884, when Kate was 9, LQC Lamar was appointed by President Cleveland to serve as the Secretary of the Interior. And he asked Edward Clark to be his assistant. And the letter that Lamar wrote to Clark is a very interesting historical document which I found in the archives at Ole Miss. And I'm going to read an excerpt to you now. I also love letters and feel like we're losing. The art of letter writing is dying, as I'm sure you would agree. Lamar writes, "My dear Clark, Cleveland has tendered me the place of Secretary of the Interior, and I have accepted. If I could have you by me to counsel and sustain me, I would feel vivified, reassured, and perfectly confident. Without you, I am for the present at sea. I want you to take the place of First Assistant Secretary of the Interior. A residence here is very pleasant. Mrs. Clark would enjoy it, and Kate would have advantages here in education not inferior to any in the country. Yours truly, LQC Lamar. And then he added a postscript. Washington is beautiful and healthy in the winter and close to summer resorts. The law is a good business here. So Clark agreed and went ahead of his family to Washington to be sworn in. And during his trip, Carrie Clark received 2 telegrams from Lamar, which are also in the archives at Ole Miss, because when her husband arrived in D.C., he was immediately taken ill. And I'm going to read you those telegrams. The first one says, Mr. Clark passed good night, says he is much better this morning. Mrs. Clark not come until further notice. LQC Lamar. Then the second shared the exciting news that Clark had been confirmed. Mr. Clark confirmed by the Senate Assistant Secretary Interior, better this morning, LQC Lamar. However, despite Lamar's telegram suggesting otherwise, Clark unexpectedly and tragically died the next day, and it was pneumonia. So Kate Freeman Clark lost her father at the age of 9, and it is my opinion that her mother, although extremely distressed by the sudden death of her husband, was equally disappointed to not be moving to Washington. She and Kate never lived in Vicksburg again. They spent most of their time in either Memphis or Holly Springs during the next 5 years. And then in 1893, Carrie decided to finally leave Holly Springs for the East Coast. She and Kate moved to New York City to finish Kate's education and further her study of art. Kate attended Dr. Gardner's School for Young Ladies for 1 year, taking classes typical of a finishing school, such as spelling, rhetoric, literature, political economy, and languages. And I saw her report card in the archives in Holly Springs, and she wasn't a very good student. She was a good artist. However, after she graduated from Gardner's is when her real education begins. Kate enrolled at the Art Students League of New York, where for the first time she joined a community of artists similar to herself, like-minded men and women with whom she could both paint and have fun. And I'm going to read to you what she says about it, but she is right there. It's an image that I found of her at the Art Students. So I write, the League was an incredibly exciting place to study for a budding artist. Many of the original faculty members have become prominent names in the history of American art. William Merritt Chase, Thomas Eakins, John Henry Twatman, Kenyon Cox, Child Hassam, and Irving Wiles. According to Art Students League archivist Stephanie Cassidy, Kate Freeman Clark's enrollment records for 1894-1895 indicate that she studied AP, which could be an abbreviation for Antique Preparatory, followed that same session by MP, or Morning Painting, and CS, or Sketch Class. Clark's very first class AP with the American Impressionist painter J.H. Twatman was a class for beginning students in order to learn essential rudimentary elements such as perspective, proportion, highlighting, and shading before progressing to painting, and was a requirement before moving to more advanced classes. So after several months of study at the League, Kate declared in her journal on March 8, 1895, I am now a League girl. entered the preparatory and have just been promoted to heads. Enjoy it intensely. She was fully immersed in League life and described a typical day in a letter to her Uncle Russell. Go to League at 9, that is when I can. Leave there at 12 and go to the conservatory and practice 2 hours, if I can have the piano. Come home, have lunch. At 1:15, I start to the sketch class, get home about 6:15. So you see, I do not always have much time. She then followed League instructor Irving Wiles, and that's Grandmama Kate and Irving Wiles, to his art school on Long Island, which was a convenient way of leaving the city during the heat of the summer. It was while attending Mr. Wiles's art school that Kate was introduced to the plein air technique, which means painting in the open air with the artist's subject in full view. Clark attended Wiles's art school for 1 summer, and it was during this time that Wiles took his students to visit the Shinnecock School of Art, the school of his mentor, the greatest American impressionist and practitioner of plein air painting of the day, William Merritt Chase. And Kate Freeman Clark was changed forever. And I'm going to show you a few scenes of Shinnecock now. Well, there's William Merritt Chase at Shinnecock, surrounded by female students, which was primarily who took his summer school classes. And there is Kate painting at Shinnecock with the model up there. There's Kate at Shinnecock, and that is William Merritt Chase's home in the background. And that's Kate looking for a scene to paint. She's literally using a device called the share motif, which helps her frame, and so she can see what it is she wants to paint. And there is William Merritt Chase. I'm going to read you a section in a minute about his look and his, he was very attractive and he was always dressed perfectly. And Kate writes in her journal that she once witnessed him painting wearing a white suit in oils and never getting a drop on his suit. And this is from a little bit later than that journal entry, but it was the closest thing I could find, and I love that. And she decided she could paint in oils after that if he could. All right, and this is Rockwell Kent, who's part of the next section of what I'm going to read. So Wiles took his students to a Chase critique session, which were open to the public once a week. Apparently, these critique sessions were quite a spectacle, and residents of Long Island, in addition to the art students, came out for the weekly event. I found versions of these critique sessions in several autobiographies of Chase art students, but a particularly descriptive one was written by the artist Rockwell Kent, who attended at the same time as Clark, and I'm just going to read you some of that. The studio where these criticisms were held, I picture this as a movie, so you need to think about it in your head. It's really a great scene. The studio where these criticisms were held was of ample size to accommodate the 50 to 100 people who, as students or as visitors, attended. The pictures were displayed on a 3-tiered reversible screen, its rear being loaded while the pictures on the front were under criticism. When all was ready, the audience in its place, the pictures mounted to be shown, the master would appear. Chase was a little man, dapper and dressed to the point of foppishness, spatted, bat-winged collared, his cravat drawn through a priceless jeweled ring. He invariably wore a carnation in his buttonhole. Gray-haired, gray-bearded, and mustachioed, he was a handsome and distinguished-looking man. Black ribbon pince nez completed, shall we say, his makeup? No, it was all natural to him, completed William Merritt Chase. And then Kent continues. He says, as the screen was turned around to bring another lot of pictures into view, the master found himself confronted by an array of dismal daubs whose subject matter, if they had any, was lost in the murk of black paint with which the canvases appeared to have been smeared. For a long time he contemplated the works, turning at last to ask who had done them. I did, Mr. Chase, came the cheerful response from a female newcomer in his audience. Again he looked at the pictures long and earnestly, only to turn with the admission that he didn't understand them. Oh, but I felt that way, Mr. Chase, said their creator. Chase took off his pince nez and looked at the lady. Madame, he said, speaking ever so earnestly, the next time you feel that way, don't paint. So for the next 6 years, Kate would continue her study at the Art Students League in the fall and spring, and then attend Chase's Shinnecock School in the summers. Painting primarily plein air, but also still life and portrait painting as well. Her years at Shinnecock were so transformative in her life and career that she herself wrote an essay about it 20 years later. And I have published that essay in its entirety in the book. It's a wonderful first-hand look at a typical Chase critique session like Kent's, but what is most interesting about it is that she writes it from her point of view when one of her paintings was critiqued alongside of Kent's, and she was awarded the prize for Best Painting of the Week. It clearly was an important day in her life and career, and the prize was Chase keeping her painting and Clark having her portrait done by the master himself. You have to buy the book to read the essay. Yeah. But that's the portrait. And you can see the Chase signature right there. But isn't it stunning? And it's in Holly Springs in the collection there. So in 1902, Chase closed his Shinnecock School and Clark stopped taking lessons at the Art Students League. She did not stop painting, however. It appears that Carrie, Kate, and Mama Kate would still travel in the summers to escape the oppressive heat of the city, often going to the Hudson River Valley, where several of Clark's landscapes were painted. And it was during 1904 to 1917 that an exciting chapter of Clark's life began, exhibiting her work. She was very timid about venturing into the exhibition realm because her mother, who chaperoned her everywhere and was a huge influence in her life, did not approve of ladies exhibiting or selling their artwork. It was not, in her opinion, a feminine endeavor. But Clark boldly attempted it anyway, despite her mother's objections, sending her work out under the gender-neutral alias Freeman Clark. And it was during this period, the first decade of the 20th century, that Carrie and Kate befriended another single mother and her artist son, Sarah and Frank Wadsworth, who also attended Chase's summer school and, like Kate and Carrie, were close to the Chases. And there is Frank Wadsworth. So again, Mama Kate gets in all the pictures that I have. She's so cute. So the letters that I found in the Clark archive from the Wadsworths were some of the most interesting. And it was Frank and his mother who cheered Kate on from the sidelines when she first started to exhibit her work. And I'm going to read you a couple of these letters, because again, I love letters. Frank Wadsworth was thrilled with the success of Clark's first exhibition attempt. In a letter he wrote, "You certainly are a genius to be able to exhibit at the National Academy. I can't." And when that success was quickly followed by paintings accepted into shows at the Boston Art Club and into the Pennsylvania Academy, he expressed his exquisite delight in her success. "I am delighted to hear of your two at the Penn Academy. That must be a fine exhibit. Everyone here in Chicago seems to think the Pittsburgh is the greatest thing going, but I don't believe it can equal the Penn." And Frank's mother, Sarah, also expressed her joy over Kate's work being accepted into the Pennsylvania Academy in a letter dated February 14, 1905. In this same letter, she inquired as to whether Clark was the Freeman Clark listed in the catalog and shared some news about Chase. "Are you the Freeman Clark mentioned in the Penn catalog? We were sure of it when we saw the subject of the painting, and we hear it was also in the Academy exhibition. Isn't that fine? We were so glad and congratulate you heartily. I've also just heard that Mr. Chase has sold his last summer's fish picture to the Corcoran for $2,000. That's a bargain. Hurrah! Are you going to Spain? We are thinking of it very seriously and wish you would decide to go too. You must see the gallery in Madrid." And of course, she's talking about the Prado. Some little gallery. Sadly, this friendship would only last a short time because Wadsworth would die suddenly while studying art in Madrid. And it is my belief that his death, followed in due time by Chase, Mama Kate, and then her mother, would simply be too much for Clark to bear. But before I get to that, let me talk about Clark's short but impressive exhibition record. Kate, as Freeman Clark, showed paintings in many prestigious galleries and shows all over the country. The Corcoran in Washington several times, the Buffalo Fine Arts Gallery, the Browse Gallery in New York City, and the most significant of her career, being chosen as one of only 60 paintings from over 900 submitted to be selected for the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. And the centennial of this event was just celebrated 2 years ago. In this exhibit, her painting, The Climbers, was exhibited alongside the greatest painters of the day, Mary Cassatt, John Singer Sargent, Winslow Homer, James McNeill Whistler, and many others. And I'm going to stop here for a minute and give you a brief slideshow of Kate Freeman Clark artwork, and from different phases and different genres in which she painted. The first few are what I call the Shinnecock group, because we can identify them as having been done at Shinnecock. So honestly, I've gone blank on some of my titles, but she never titled or dated any of her work. So the titles were given by the gallery in Holly Springs. Some are signed, some are not. That one, I don't see it, but I think it is. It might have gotten cut off. I'm going to show you her signature on a better example yet. This one's called Muddy Road, and it also is a Shinnecock painting.
It is muddy.
This one was one I found in the back in storage at the gallery, and it is William Merritt Chase's house. And I was able to identify it from a photograph I had found of his house from the Smithsonian Archive. So when I saw the photograph and then saw this painting, I recognized it as, to me, being historically important, and obviously putting her there at Shinnecock. In the book, I put the photograph beside the painting so you can see the resemblance. This is one of her very beautiful paintings called Moore's Mill Pond, and it's lovely, and she does reflection extremely well. And this is just another example of that, her expertise in reflection in water. She also did a lot of domestic scenes of women engaged in work, similar to Mary Cassatt. This is a woman sewing, very pretty. And this one, very chaste. These are very similar to things William Merritt Chase would do. This one's called The Gardens, and actually has been purchased by a private collector, and he did a wonderful job restoring it. And the same parasol, you can see that was in the first painting, it comes up again in this one. She did flowers extremely well, both in still life and in these more genre paintings. And William Merritt Chase even made the comment that flowers were very hard to do, and she did them exceptionally well. This is one called White Blossoms, and I love this one because you need to really get close to it to see these little details in the background, or they can get lost. And the photographer who took the photos for the book, Will Jacks, out of Cleveland, Mississippi, he did a great job with detailed shots of paintings. So in the book, not only is the painting there, but you'll see some of these shots as well, so you don't miss anything. She did animals like the ducks and chickens, roosters, cows. This one, as you can tell, is not even framed. I mean, if you get in the back room at the gallery at Holly Springs, there's stacks of just things she did very quickly. I mean, that's sketches for class, so that's why there are so many works. This is one of my favorites because she didn't do many portraits and she didn't do many children. It's called Agnes in Her Purple Plaid Dress. I do not know who Agnes is, never saw anything in anything I read, but it's just a lovely portrait. And she did still life, as I said, flowers very well. But part of the thing I wanted to show in the book was the variety of styles she painted in. Because if you do know Kate Freeman Clark, a lot of people only think of her as the landscapist, and she really did so much more. Another still life. And here is the landscapes. This is one of her big paintings called March Meadows that hangs. And there's the signature Freeman Clark, which suggests to me that it was exhibited at one time. But when I looked through lots of the exhibition catalogs, names of paintings would change. So I'm not sure if this painting went by another name at a different time. That's another one that shows the cows up in the front, the rock wall. And this is more, I would say, the Hudson River scene. We've left Shinnecock now. This one is historically interesting because in the 1980s, a few of her paintings were selected to participate in the Arts and Embassy program, which is a great honor for an artist, and they traveled to Europe and hung in embassies in France and Belgium, and it really was a nice thing that the gallery got involved in the 1980s. And the tag was still on the back of this painting. And there's her signature again. And her signature changes over time. If you look in the book, and in the front and in the back on those end pages, we did a sampling of all the different signatures. This is just one I like House with rock wall is what it's become known as, but it's just stunning. This one, I wanted to show you a sampling of the different seasons. She painted not just in the summers when she escaped New York, but she obviously got away in the fall and painted different times of year, as this attests to. And this is one of the only ones that I'm aware of that she did in the winter and with snow. And then there's the, there's the signature, which is where I'll stop.
Did she always write the Kate?
When she was exhibiting. So most of the papers that I found in the archives, they're all addressed to Dear Mr. Freeman Clark. Nobody knew they were dealing with a woman. Yeah. So what's interesting about this period of her life is that even though she was exhibiting a bit, she was not painting as much. The art world was changing. The Armory show of 1913 ushered in a new modernist style of art, one which Chase and his followers did not embrace. And here's some scenes from the Armory show. I love the cartoon on the, on the bottom here. They're trying to figure out what they're looking at. Yep, yeah. In fact, Chase dies 3 years after the Armory show. He dies in 1916. And the sale of his works, his beautiful plein air landscapes, as well as his portraits and still lifes, were all sold next to nothing. And Clark remained loyal to Chase in terms of her style. And I've only found a few examples in her collection that, although quite good, can be considered modernist. And here's an example of one. This is a really beautiful painting called Elevated Train. Probably one of the most abstract in the collection. And then these are two tiny watercolors. This is called Bright Lights in the Big City. And then this one, Night Lights. And they're just this one and the previous one are just real small watercolors. So in her journal, she writes about the death of Chase and what she calls the sad sale of his paintings and studio artifacts. And I want to read that to you because she's right there. She puts us on the front lines of art history. She says, "The sale of the studio furnishings was as poor and heartbreaking as that of the pictures and still life objects. The pictures brought a little more than the first night. It was a 2-night sale. But oh, so little. Mr. Rittenberg, he's a fellow artist from Shinnecock, he bought the one of Mr. Chase, painting himself sitting on a high stool. But on the rounds it is called Twilight in the Studio for $150. My recollection is that it was of the reflection on a picture glass, not a mirror, which caused the low tone, not twilight. I was wild to go that night just to bid on that, if on nothing else. Shouldn't wonder if he, Mr. R. Rittenberg, bought the other things I wanted, as our tastes seemed the same. The total of all sales was $60,151.50. Now that number is in her journal, and then I confirmed it in a biography of Chase. It should have been 200,000 or 300,000, I think, in normal times, or more, as most things went below 100. It seemed like a party of harpies preying on his body and picking the bones. I am sorry I did not get a souvenir of some kind." Another reason that Kate abandoned painting at this time was that Mama Kate was living with Carrie and Kate in their boarding house in New York, in the city, and her health was not good. It was also World War I, and art was not much on Kate's mind. Her journals during this period provide a first-hand look at life in the city during the war and the onerous conditions under which the 3 generations of women lived. I love that. It reminds me of Whistler. I'm going to read you this final excerpt. This is from her journals about the city. Mama Kate, much affected by the heat. A day or so more would have finished her, I think. She was so weak she wanted to lie down all the time, and she did for 2 days. Kept her cooler with cold water or ice in a hot water bag. Life is most uncomfortable here. Would give anything in the world if we were at home, or even if we had an apartment. Mama Kate seems to sense the disturbed state of our minds, and though we say nothing to her of moving, seems to think we have and gets confused from one room to the other and thinks she is in a strange place. If she is to have the discomfort of thinking she has moved, she might as well have the actual comfort in my brain. It breaks my heart to have her last days spent this way. Sorry, books, papers, remote. Kate finally returns to Holly Springs, but not until both Mama Kate and Carrie die, which occurred 3 years apart. Mama Kate in 1919, after the conclusion of the war, and her mother in 1922 from her own health problems. Kate finally returns to the family home place after making much-needed repairs. And this is an image of it today. And she even added an upstairs studio, suggesting she intended to paint. Yet she never does, nor does she bring her paintings back to Holly Springs with her. She leaves them in a warehouse in New York City, where they had been in storage since before Carrie's death, as there was no room for them at the boarding house where they lived. Clark lived a traditional Southern lady's life in Holly Springs, becoming involved in the community through her church as well as other activities. And my theory as to why she never paints again is because she no longer had the support system that she needed. Her teacher, her mother, her grandmother, and her friend, Frank Wadsworth, all gone. I also think she was physically exhausted and depressed, and that comes from letters that I've read, and the evidence is in the book. And her eyes were beginning to give her trouble. And I say she never painted again, but we do have 2 paintings that we can identify as Mississippi scenes, but we don't know when they were painted, as Clark did not date any of her work. So these are the 2 Mississippi paintings. This one's entitled Work Out in Mississippi Grove. Beautiful painting. And this one's called the Schubert House, and this is the house that's right behind the Kate Freeman Clark's house in Holly Springs. It's also the painting that will be included in the bicentennial show at the Mississippi Museum of Art this coming year. In fact, it would be her vision that would make her a recluse at the end of her life. By the end of the 1930s, she withdrew and spent most of her time inside. And that's the Kate Freeman Clark that citizens today who I talk to remember, a crazy cat lady. But this version of Kate Freeman Clark is not the Kate Freeman Clark that I want us to remember. Clark died in 1957 at the age of 81, and one of the first items I read in my research was her will, an extraordinary document that woke the citizens of Holly Springs up to the incredible artist that she was. They had no idea until the reading of her will that she had studied with William Merritt Chase and had over 1,000 paintings in storage in New York City. Her will expressed her desire that a permanent gallery be built to house them, and she left $60,000 to the city to build it. She also hoped that her home, Freeman Place, and its contents could, quote, fill some useful social or artistic functions such as museum, library, art gallery, or a civic guest house, or a women's club. She was clearly concerned about her legacy since she left no direct heirs. Her wishes were carried out by the city of Holly Springs, and a small gallery was built for the paintings. However, before the gallery was built, Holly Springs had to find places to hang all of these paintings. They literally arrived at the bank of Holly Springs in a van, in a truck, all these paintings. So the majority were stored at the bank, but others found homes at the water department, the Episcopal Church, several of the historic homes in Holly Springs, and one article I read said they literally rented a house for a lot of them. So even after the gallery officially opened in 1963, several of her works remained in these locations. And I went around, and Carla's here, Carla went with me, and we went around Holly Springs and located them. And they have since been, several have since been returned to the gallery, and I think putting the book together was the excuse to get them back to the gallery to photograph them, and they're not letting them out again. So I want to conclude with a quote from Clark. Oh, actually, let me miss these slides first. This is an interior view of the gallery in Holly Springs. And this is the Marshall County Historical Museum, which if you're going to write a book about Kate Freeman Clark, you have to spend time in both places because her paintings are at the gallery, but her life is at the museum. This is when I say I worked at the archives, this is it. And the archives is not MDAH, which it's a dark room with papers and boxes and not even a functioning copy machine. But we made do and got it done. But that's where you can go, and if you spend a day in Holly Springs, be sure to visit both places. And this is where I will conclude. And it's a quote from Clark from notes I found for a talk she gave in 1925 to the Thursday Club, which is a women's study club in Holly Springs that she was a member of and which still exists today. It's actually the oldest women's club in Mississippi. And she talked about art, of course, and it's where I found the title of my book. Read from my book. An artist was painting a brook which flowed by the wayside. The day was brilliantly clear, and the deep blue of the zenith was even a deeper and more royal blue when reflected from the glistening surface of the little pool beneath the bridge. The blue was thrown into startling relief by the juxtaposition of the dark reflection of the deep green trees on the banks. A country man who habitually passed that way 6 times a day was amazed into questioning the color on the canvas. "Why do you paint the water blue?" he asked. And the artist replied, "Come down and look." The man descended the bank and looking exclaimed in a dazed way, "Why, it is blue." He had never noticed that the color of the water changed with the color of the sky above it. Nearly everyone reacts to color. Can you doubt that there was more in that man's daily walk for him after seeing the artist's sketch? So in conclusion, I'm excited to tell you that you don't have much time, but until July 22nd in Oxford at the Art Museum on the campus of Ole Miss is the largest exhibit of Clark's work to date. The exhibit was designed to tie in with the publication of my book, and it opened at the end of March. But if you can't get to Oxford, several of her paintings will be traveling to the Mississippi Museum of Art here in Jackson, and that show opens on August 17th. You're literally the first group. I've announced that too. And the latest news is that from Jackson, her paintings will travel to Little Rock. So it truly is the year of Kate Freeman Clark, and I'm excited to have the privilege of sharing her story with you. Thanks. So I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any. No?
I have one.
Yeah,
Will there be an exhibit in New York?
I wish, but no, I have not been in touch with anyone, but I do think the connection with Shinnecock and Chase does suggest that a show could be done in New York. And I did a lot of research with the Parish Art Museum, which is the archives of Chase, and so several images in the book, not in the slideshow because I can only have permission to use them for certain things, but there are several images from the parish in the book. So yes, they're aware of Kate Freeman Clark. Yeah. Am I a curator? No, I'm an English professor who likes to write biographies of women. That's the connection, yeah.
How did you get interested in?
In Kate and Clark? Well, I had written the two previous books, which were on Mississippi women writers, Eudora Welty and Margaret Walker, and I was in the fortunate position that my publisher, University Press, who are here today, said, who do you want to do next? And there was not another woman writer that I got excited about. And so I started thinking about art because I took a lot of art history in college and loved it. And so I literally was looking through Patty Carr Black's book, Art in Mississippi. And in that book is that painting that I showed you, Work Out in Mississippi Grove. It's a full-length reproduction, and it stopped me. I mean, the painting just stopped me cold. And that book is basically just encyclopedia-length entries of artists, but the story, she told the story of how after Clark died and leaving the money and the will, and that's what got my interest. That's an incredible story. I would like to see if there's anything more out there about her, and so that's the next thing a biographer does, is see if anybody's written a book, and no one had. The only things out there on Clark were an exhibition catalog that had an essay in it that was done by the press in the early 80s, and then a dissertation that I found. Someone did a dissertation on her and her family, but everything else were short essays and very few articles. So to me, the door was open. So that's how it happened. Yeah.
Did she go out for the Pan Pacific exhibition?
I don't think she did. There's a lot of papers in the archives, all connected to the exhibition, but nothing that I saw that suggested she literally traveled there. But she had the papers all associated with it. Yeah.
All right. Well, Chase also taught in Carmel.
Yeah. He taught everywhere, right? Yeah. He taught at Shinnecock for the 6 years, or longer than that, and then he closed that. And then he started doing the same thing he was doing at Shinnecock in Europe. That's why her friend Frank Wadsworth went to Madrid, and he did that same summer type of program in many cities. And yes, he taught out west too, you're right. Yeah.
And I know he was in that time, he was in Carmel.
Okay.
So that's why I was.
So a little later, yeah, from when
Well,
Kate
it was
Clark knew.
1914.
Yeah, well then he dies in
Right.
1916, yeah. Yeah, question more. Yeah, hey!
Carolyn, thoroughly enjoyed it. You've done 3 fabulous books about 3 phenomenal women of Mississippi. What have you learned about, what's your overall impression? They're not that far apart time-wise.
Yeah.
What's your impression of the role of women in Mississippi? You've done 2 white women, 1 black woman, and I'm just curious how you see the role of women during this era when our state, about to celebrate its 200th anniversary, was in such turmoil and transition.
Yeah, what a good question. Well, it's interesting you bring it up because I also have a talk, because I wrote the Welty and Walker book, and they were almost exact contemporaries. I realized I was in this unique position to see the similarities and differences in their life. And so if Kristen wants to invite me back, I have a talk that compares Welty and Walker literally about how much harder it was for Margaret Walker. Even though they both were for the WPA, which I discovered, and they had a lot of similarities, but yes, because one was white and one was black, much harder, not just in Mississippi, but nationally. Then Kate Freeman Clark, I found she was, and again, it might be the South more than Mississippi, but obviously her mother, and I didn't go into this, but I do in the book, wanted her to get married. So even though I think her mother sent her this very, paradoxical message of, yes, I'll take you to study with William Merritt Chase, like the greatest artist of the time, but I don't want you to sell or exhibit your work. I still want you to go find a husband. And so it never, I think that held her back. And just a few years later, Marie Hull, George O'Keeffe have women who had, and they just come a little bit later. George O'Keeffe was also a student of Chase's, the first decade of the 1900s. And, she went out and did it. She went out and found her own style, and had a husband who supported her. And I feel like Kate Freeman Clark was a few years too early. Just couldn't break away from her mother's influence, didn't find the husband. The man that came closest to being her husband ended up, you can read it in the book, but he was a military man who was accused of embezzlement. And even if it wasn't true, he couldn't be associated with this family, who obviously had a Confederate general and political ties. I mean, they didn't want anything to do with him anymore. And she had there was about 10 years, a decade of correspondence between the two of them. So, I don't know does that answer your question? It's a sense of, I think in these 3 cases, I don't know if I can answer it for all women, but I do think it held them back, definitely. I think Welty had the easiest time of it, but it wasn't all easy for her either, obviously. So, yeah, Tom.
You showed a couple of images that immediately reminded me of Marie Hall. Is there any evidence that they knew each other or communicated?
Clark did not. I do write about how there was this burgeoning art movement in Mississippi, but she chose not to get involved in it. I mean, she literally moved back to Holly Springs, and I think she had the years of caretaking of her grandmother and mother literally physically wore her out, and the war. And I try to, as I say, I'm a biographer who wrote about a painter. I'm not an art historian. So I was fascinated by her life and what her struggles. And I do think that, no, she chose to turn her back on the art when she came back to Mississippi. I think she just wanted to relax. I think she wanted to be a Southern lady, enjoy church, other things that she didn't for many years. Yeah.
Based on these remarks to this, I assume it's a ladies' club.
Right.
Obviously, she's showing her interest and knowledge of art, but you didn't find any evidence that anybody knew.
The only person who said she gave lessons to was her, a relative, and it wasn't on a regular basis. The only evidence of her continued ties to the art world in New York were letters between Irving Wiles stayed in touch with her after she moved back to Holly Springs and encouraged her to paint. That's where I think she was depressed, because he suggested in his letters, this will help you get out of it, even though he didn't specify what. Also, she's continued to subscribe to art magazines that kept her, and she had some female friends who were continuing in New York, and one of her friends, who I quote a few times, says, if I only had your talent, you need to be continuing to paint. Because she didn't think she was nearly as talented, but she was still struggling to make, have a career in New York. So,
Kind of picturing like today a storage building or unit that you had up there. So I guess you had somebody up there making sure the rent was paid. Or
How did it sit down?
it was called the Lincoln Warehouse.
Records where they pay you.
Yeah, it was just a regular monthly, it was literally a storage unit. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did her art financially support her, or how was she
No, the money, the three women, a lot of the money came from her Edward Clark's work in Vicksburg. He actually had established a plantation that was a working plantation, and that, and I didn't go into this in the book so much. I felt like there were so many different, paths I could have gone, but I did see papers in the archives of even a lawsuit that had come up during her lifetime, arguing about the monthly allowance and getting it paid out. So they lived on a budget that allowed them to, but they didn't live, they lived frugally. But no, the art, she was never paid. I mean, her mother would not have approved of her literally getting paid for the art. So the loan, it was on exhibition for free. Yeah. To Walter Anderson, I think they were much more entrepreneurial and ran it like a business, but I'm no expert on Walter Anderson, so no.
What was the name of Clark's property in Vicksburg?
Well,
I always hear of the Davis Bend.
Well, he named, it's Cary. Isn't there a little area outside of Cary?
Outside of Rolling Fork,
It's Cary, after her. He was very much in love with his wife, Carrie Clark, Carrie Wathall Freeman, and I can't read everything, but I will hope you'll buy the book, because the letters between Edward and Carrie are very much how much he loves her and wishes she'd stop spending so much time in Holly Springs with her mother, get down to Vicksburg more. So he misses them desperately. He misses his wife and daughter, and as a sign of his love, literally created this, the area outside called Cary for that reason. Yeah. Any good questions?
That's a pretty good one to end on, though. It's a nice segue.
Next book. I'll end on that. Yeah, my editor is sitting here. The next book is going to be a book on the de Grummond collection. Does everyone know the de Grummond collection? No book has ever been done on the de Grummond, and that's a collection of children's literature materials at Southern Miss. It is an unbelievable collection. They have all the Ray's Curious George papers and artwork. They have Ezra Jack Keats collection. And the reason I got interested was I've been involved with the collection a little bit with my books, but I wondered if Lena de Grummond, the woman who founded the collection, was worthy of a book. So I went down there to look into that and decided that she's, of course, instrumental, but the book's more about the collection than her, so she will be chapter 1. But she didn't establish it until after literally her first retirement, and not until she was in her 60s. And then did an incredible letter writing campaign. Again, letters play a part in all my books. That I have been reading, and they're just amazing. Just writing letters to ask people to send materials because she wanted to be a better teacher. She was teaching children's literature at Southern and wanted to literally bring in show and tell items, and that's how the collection started. So the book, it's good that it's coming out after this one, because they looked at this book and said, we want this. We want this size and maybe a lot of photography and images and, so yeah, I'm excited about it, but don't look for it anytime soon.